Hi, my name is Deepak Malhotra, and I'm a professor of negotiations at Harvard Business School. I'm also the author of Negotiating the Impossible and the co-author with Max Bazerman of Negotiation Genius. I put together a series of video clips, each is about 2 to 3 minutes long, where I talk about something related to negotiations. A tip, an insight, a principle, a strategy that might be useful to you in your own negotiations as you're navigating deals and disputes at work and in your daily life. In this session, I want to talk about something that's suddenly become a lot more important for people, which is negotiating when you're not face to face. A lot of us, when this video is being recorded, are in lockdown during the coronavirus. A lot of businesses have either had to shut down or, in other cases, have to take their operations online. This includes team meetings, this includes communications with various stakeholders, and it means negotiations. And a number of folks have asked me about what changes when you start negotiating not face to face in the room together, but over a platform like Zoom or GoToMeeting or Skype, etc. And here I want to talk about some of the things that you might not even notice have changed during these platforms being used for negotiations, but which can have an impact on whether or not you have a successful negotiation. So let's talk about a few of the things that are different when you negotiate face to face versus over something like Zoom. First, face-to-face negotiations allow us to be much more comfortable with silence. When you're on a Zoom call or you're in a Zoom negotiation, people are not as comfortable just being quiet with nobody talking, especially if multiple people are online at the same time. Silence during negotiations is actually pretty important and pretty useful. It gives you time to think. It gives you time to think about whether you want to change the trajectory of the conversation. If things are getting a little bit heated, it allows you to think about how to cool things down. So these informal, unscheduled moments of silence are actually pretty important. But when we get into a conversation over a platform like Zoom, they feel very uncomfortable, and people fill that space by talking. So that's one issue. The second thing is that face-to-face negotiations are often very nonlinear. We talk about one thing and then somebody decides to move the conversation in a slightly different direction. People don't think of it as being very awkward if a lot of things are flying around at the same time. Now think about the last Zoom conversation you had or the last phone conversation you had where you were negotiating something. Much more likely that it was very path dependent. You each are responding and reacting to the last thing the person said. And because of that, the conversation is likely to be less divergent, less creative, and less likely to explore different avenues or different approaches for attacking the problem. The third thing that's different, especially if you're negotiating with multiple people on each side of the table, when you're face to face, typically all the people are in the room with you. That gives you a lot of opportunities in the room and during coffee breaks or when you get up to stretch or when you take a little break to caucus and coordinate with your team members. But when everybody is just a face on the screen and things are being thrown around from the two sides of the table, but you're not co-located with your own team, it's very hard to coordinate. And one of the consequences of that is that people become a little bit more risk averse. People become a little bit more conservative about what they will and will not say because they're not sure they're on solid ground as far as their own team is concerned. And the fourth thing that changes when you move from face-to-face negotiation to something like Zoom negotiation is even more subtle. If you've traveled a long way to go to the person's office that you're negotiating with or into their city if you've flown in, the two sides are going to be a little bit more persistent. When they run into roadblocks, when they run into deadlock, when they run into some sort of conflict or dispute, or if the offers seem very far apart, you're already there, you've already made the effort to be in the room, you try hard to push through it. It's a lot easier on a platform like Zoom to just call it off. If the two sides are too far apart, it's just very easy to say, you know what, doesn't look like we're going to get very far today. Let's call it quits. I mean, what's the cost? You haven't invested much, so it's a lot easier to just shut it down. Now let's think about those four problems. Zoom conversations, as opposed to face-to-face conversations, are less comfortable with silence. They're less linear, they're too linear. Your team is not co-located with you, so you can't coordinate as effectively. And it might be a little bit too easy for people to give up rather than push through when challenges arise. So what do you do about this? Well, first, just knowing those things, knowing those barriers exist, might change the way in which you approach the negotiation. But here are some specific things that I'd advise you to do, actually in many negotiations, but especially when you're negotiating through platforms like Zoom. First, it's very helpful to send an agenda to the other side up front with as many items that you think you want to cover already delineated. This makes it a little bit more likely that you don't get stuck on one conversation for too long, that you are able to leverage that agenda, that piece of paper that was sent in advance, to move the conversation along and make sure enough things are covered that are important to you. Second, not just sending an agenda, but perhaps sending the proposal that you want to discuss also in advance. Now, why would you do this? In negotiations, surprises are usually not helpful. If you're going to propose something creative, or if you're going to propose something that the other side would need to discuss, or maybe talk to their boss about, or really wrap their head around, the last thing you want to do is throw it at them in a Zoom call. And the only thing that they're able to do then is respond in a way that's very, very restrictive, that's not very, very creative, that's not open to new ideas or new suggestions. So sending a proposal in advance is a very good way of allowing the other side to show up more prepared. And perhaps counterintuitively to some people, the more prepared the other side is, actually negotiations are going to go more smoother for both of you. Now, I'll leave it up to you to think about how much of the proposal you want to share in advance and how soon to send it, because there is some variation on that. Sometimes I advise people to wait until maybe an hour before the conversation, before the proposal is sent, because you don't want it hanging out there for a very long time. Other times you want to give them even more time. Sometimes the proposal is going to be detailed. Sometimes it's going to be the outline of the proposal, but there's some things we want to fill in when we actually have the conversation. But sending something in advance can be pretty useful. Next, because these meetings can abruptly end or can end maybe before everything was covered that you wanted to cover, it's useful if in advance you have already managed expectations and coordinated with the other side on the need for more than one of these calls. Don't try to do everything in one meeting in the way you might have been able to accomplish if it was face-to-face. Setting up a second or third meeting in advance gives you a little bit of space to leave things that didn't get covered without having some awkward conversation at the end of trying to schedule another meeting which maybe wasn't anticipated. So thinking of this as a longer process and a more carefully thought through process rather than I show up, we try to negotiate, and then we see what happens. Next, during the Zoom conversations themselves, schedule breaks. Again, you can coordinate on this before the negotiations begin, but decide in advance that if you're going to have a 1 hour conversation, that maybe 20 minutes into it or 30 minutes into it or every 15 to 20 minutes into it or every half an hour into your negotiations, you're going to take a bit of a break. It gives all sides a chance to step back, sort of clear their head, think a little bit about where they are and where they need to be going, and to coordinate with their own team. So instead of having to call an audible in the middle of the negotiation and say, you know what, I need to take a break, if you've already scheduled some of these in, it gives you that breathing space you need, the thinking space you need, and the coordination space you need. And finally, manage expectations. I think everybody walking into this new environment is a little bit anxious about how it's going to work. But it's useful if one of you, and why not you, be the one who says early on, listen, this is maybe not the way we typically do things, so perhaps some things might come across as awkward. We might end up talking over each other. There might be situations where one of us misunderstands each other. That's probably normal in this kind of a setting. So why don't we go ahead and make sure we give each other the benefit of the doubt? So if we say something that comes across as maybe too abrupt, or that it sounded like we weren't listening to you, or we missed something you said, you let us know and we'll do the same for you. And if we schedule a bit of a longer process for this, hopefully it's more likely to go well. With every negotiation, whether it's face-to-face or in a Zoom meeting, one of the things I advise people to do is after the negotiation is over, it's a good idea to send an email, a note to the other side or the other parties that were involved, just to touch base, make sure you were on the same page. You want to make sure things were heard appropriately and similarly by all parties. Sending an email or a note like that is a great way to confirm what was agreed to and where things stand in the process to date. It's also a good opportunity to ask questions that maybe you forgot to ask during the conversation because too much was going on. And finally, it provides an opportunity for you to frame the negotiations in the way you most want to frame them, to make sure they understand the extent to which you think this is an important negotiation, or whether you want to emphasize that you have other opportunities so you don't seem too weak, or whether you want to frame it a little bit in a more friendly way than it came across during the actual conversation. It gives you just one more bite at the apple. So send that email afterwards, send that note afterwards, and let people know If you have any questions, let people know where you think you are in the process to make sure you're on the same page, and use it as an opportunity to reframe the negotiation in the best possible way. So to just reflect back on the things we talked about, Zoom negotiations or Skype or GoToMeeting negotiations differ from face-to-face negotiations because face-to-face negotiations, people are much more comfortable with silence. The conversations are much more nonlinear and less path dependent, which is a good thing. The teams are usually co-located and they can coordinate more effectively. And people feel committed to the process because they put the effort to being in there. All of these things can facilitate deal making. When you find yourself in a Zoom environment, those facilitators aren't there. So you need to be prepared in advance and to create a process in advance and approach the negotiation in advance in such a way that you knock down those barriers that these platforms, which otherwise are great, they're efficient, they're cost effective, they're actually pretty amazing in terms of getting a lot of work done in a lot of different ways. But we want to make sure that when we get down to the business of negotiating, we don't lose out simply because we don't know how to handle this technology in the best way possible. Good luck on your future negotiations, and stick tuned for more videos.